Welcome to the Waterfowl East podcast. Matthew Wilson here.
And Scott Gilliland, a retired biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service, Atlantic region.
Scott Gilliland. This is our the third part of our series with Canadian Wildlife Service and some of the waterfowl industry's finer minds, rather than our own. People are getting tired of listening to us, Scott, so we've had to call in some reinforcements. So Scott's here today, just working his way through from Quebec. So it's super nice to have you here. Welcome to Bedell.
Well, thank you.
As I said,
my first time.
Yeah, when you came, yeah. Well, I'm not surprised. There's not a lot of people that have been here, so it's just one of those things. It's a small area, but hopefully I can get Ted and Ryan up here next year to do some geese, and we do have some good spots for hopefully some black ducks. We do have a lot of mallards, but for their winter banding project, there's 2 or 3 spots here I might be able to get them into. It's cool. Just, I know that obviously black ducks are easier to catch coastal, but we do have some here, so it wouldn't be a waste of their time.
You can catch them anywhere.
Yeah.
They come on bait, yeah.
Yeah.
It's getting them on bait.
Yeah, well, we have a lot of places that pack potatoes here, so they just have basically almost like they imprinted on these places because they know to come back there when the snow's on every year, and they stay all winter. Like I said in previous podcasts, I feel bad for the people south of us because there's been a ton that are staying. Yeah,
and I guess I had some problems with we've seen this banding in the black duck band, winter banding in Nova Scotia. We're banding at it was someone's farm, and he has I think he has geese there, so he's feeding them. He's feeding them all the time.
Like wild geese?
Wild geese.
Okay.
Or no, not wild geese. He's got his own captive birds, right? And so he has lots of ducks. He holds birds there for a long time, and then we give him corn to feed, so he feeds, and then we trap there.
Right.
And really what you're after is survival, and in a natural condition. And then they're at kind of at the northern edge of their wintering range. So it's probably a little harder to get through the winters. In fact, I ran a banding station in St. John. We went through a really cold period, and I was finding dead birds just frozen, so they're just aren't able to make it through the winter.
I guess that happened a lot this winter on the South Shore of Nova Scotia.
I don't know.
People were saying that, well, I think at the time I was doing that podcast with Ryan, and it was kind of fresh that a few people from the South Shore had called me and said they were finding dead birds, and they're like, oh, it must be avian influenza. And I said, could it be the cause that they're actually starving? Like you wouldn't, and he's like, yeah, you get enough weather.
Yeah, we don't know, but it could be. The problem is, we're after survival. And those birds they're basically fed ad lib. They're held there because there's lots of food, so it's not a natural situation. So you're getting a biased estimate of survival, which is maybe something to be concerned about if you're overestimating survival. And when you start to use survival in the models to manage populations, you don't want to overestimate it.
Yeah, true. I suppose that I never thought about it that way.
But we're attracted to band at places where the birds concentrate.
Sure.
Yeah,
makes sense.
Yeah, and I think in some cases, we don't get the estimates that we get from that are not representative, of the larger population in general in that general area. Anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because to me, it was such a foreign thought to think that on the ocean they could starve. Like I would always think that there would be places for them to eat, but if it's too cold, when the tide goes out, the flats like flash freeze, and then they can't get down. They can't eat them, right? They can't get to anything, I suppose. So yeah, I suppose that in a way that if the food that they want is not available, then
or there's only so much, and then what happens is you have birds that maybe not foraging all the time on the coast or in some of the maybe more estuaries and that do freeze out, and then they go to the coast which is already full,
right?
And so you add a bunch more birds and there's just not enough. There might not be enough food, and I'm completely speculating now. But that's how it would work.
Well, and I mean I think that's part of your job is, we have an idea, we speculate on maybe what it is, and, you test them, and if there's possibly no avian influenza, then...
Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go down.
We're on black ducks now. So.
Yeah, black ducks now, yeah. Tell me a little bit about your Eider research. I watched a video here from the Joint Sea Duck Venture about where have all the Eiders gone, and I saw you on there, and it was really well done, actually, and that gave a lot of information, because I know as an Eider hunter myself for many years, the areas where we hunt them, it certainly seems like there's not as many, but when you travel a little bit, certainly if you go down to Rhode Island, Narragansett Bay, we talked about I'd hunted down there, geez, seems like they're healthy in other places, so...
Yeah, there's lots happening with Eiders. It's very dynamic right now, and I would say we really don't know what's going on. We have, lots of hunters have really local information, so they much more precise, but know what's happening in their backyard, but they don't necessarily have the big picture. I think we have part of the big picture.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure we have all the bits to put the story together yet. But that project started because of our winter surveys and surveys here in New Brunswick. So we have spring surveys that were conducted by the province of New Brunswick. They fly all from St. John right down to Maine, all the islands in the spring, counting males. And that survey was initiated, I think, around 1986, but it went operational around 1990, and it ran, the last time it was flown was 2017. Things were pretty good at the beginning, but they've since, we're not sure exactly where the tipping point is, but probably around somewhere between 2000 and 2005, they've gone into a pretty steep decline. And, we had what we were thinking between 9,000 and 10,000 breeding pairs in New Brunswick. And I think the last survey we were down around 2,500.
Really?
Yeah. So
Jeez.
I can't remember what the decline, I can't remember the rate, but they're declining, at 5 or 6, I'm going to say 5 or 6% per year. That might not be exactly right, but, yeah, it indicates that there's a real problem with breeding. Then we initiated surveys for northern Eiders in Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador back in 2000, and it's how we were monitoring northern Eiders. And then we just 2006 we just wanted to have a complete picture of what Eider distribution looked like on the east coast of Canada. So we flew in 2006. We flew all of Newfoundland and Quebec and the Maritimes for Eiders. And then by 2010, the people flying the surveys here in New Brunswick were saying, we think there's a problem with Eiders. We're seeing many fewer Eiders at that point. In Nova Scotia, the crew there, the province did a lot of Eider banding, and they're starting to complain that there's no longer enough Eiders on the colonies to run a banding program. There's just not enough birds there to catch them, so we knew something was going on. And the other, we were talking earlier about molt. The sea ducks, the males, after breeding, take on a molt migration. And there was a large molting site in southwest Nova Scotia, and there was another one down off of around, I've forgotten the name, Acadia. No, I've forgotten the name. It's just, anyway, in Maine, there was another large molting site. Maybe we figured between 50 and 75,000 birds molting on these sites.
Wow.
We have two major molting sites, with tens of thousands of birds.
Okay.
And those sites, they start complaining. They're also banding at both of those sites.
Okay.
They're running big banding programs. In Nova Scotia, the technique they use is they come up 2 or 3 zodiacs, and they have a bigger work boat. And they come in and you pick up the flock and you circle around it, the zodiacs, and the birds go into a tight group. and then they use the province as a helicopter. They come in low over the birds that tip up over the side, and they shoot it with a net gun.
No way.
And then the Zodiacs come in, they pick up, pull it in, they take it to the workboat and take the birds out, and they get banned, hundreds of birds. And,
wow.
And because they're this huge, dense flocks.
Yeah.
But they're complaining, again, just like in the colonies where they can't ban females on the islands because there are no longer that many females on the islands. They're disappearing from both of those molt sites. In Maine, they used a different technique. They used a big drive trap. So they had a place where there's like an island. It would be 2 islands at high tide, but at low tide, there's a bridge.
Okay.
Like a
land bridge.
Yeah, a tickle.
Right.
In Newfoundland, it'd be called tickle.
Right.
And what they do is set up a big drive trap, and they wait until the water floods over that, and they drive the birds, and you drive them right into the trap, close it off, and when the tide goes down, they're dry and inside the trap, and you can catch 1,000 birds that way.
Wow.
I don't know if we're certainly catching hundreds
wow.
at a time, and they had to close that site down because there's not enough birds to ban. So an abandonment of the molt site, decline on the breeding site, and then the winter surveys also showed big declines across the coast of Nova Scotia, and in New Brunswick as well. So we've almost lost all the birds wintering on the mainland coast of New Brunswick, and there's still reasonable numbers. It declined, but it's probably recovered a bit in Grand Manan.
As far as numbers go?
Yeah, I think they're doing fairly well on Grand Manan. But
and you said when you talked before, you said that the reason that we're not shooting them in February is because in February there's a lot of those birds that, what did you say, that aren't migrating? They're just there?
No, I don't know if I said that.
Maybe I was talking to somebody else.
Yeah.
That might have been Ted that told me that.
We know from past work, a lot of the birds that breed in New Brunswick. So we had a pretty large banding program on the wolves in the 80s,
mm-hmm.
and we were well connected with most of the hunters in Passamaquoddy Bay at the same time, and also we're actively hunting and collecting birds, and so we got most of the band recoveries. And it's been a while since I've looked at that data, but it showed that a large proportion of the birds that breed in New Brunswick, or that bred in New Brunswick now, were overwintering here. So yeah, you're hunting local birds, but I mean, we've hunted in places like down off Pokalogan, sitting in one spot, and we shot a bird banded at Labrador, a bird banded northern Newfoundland, and a bird banded, 2 birds that I banded, or one I banded, one I was involved with, and another, a friend of mine, banded in the St. Lawrence estuary in Quebec.
Wow!
So we know they all come through there. There's birds from everywhere, but
right.
A big chunk of what was overwintering in New Brunswick would have been breeding source in New Brunswick as well.
Okay.
At least historically.
In February? I guess that would be over
that
winter.
Would be over winter.
Yeah.
I couldn't say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the cool things that with that research that you guys were doing there, when you were putting those GPSs on them.
It wasn't a GPS. So we're using a different technology. So there's a couple of different technologies that are used in tracking. One is it's called a GSM tag.
Okay.
And so it uses the same technology that's in your cell phone. So it uses the cell service for communication. And just like your phone, it has a GPS card on the tag. So it collects information about time and location from the GPS, and it transmits it back to us through the cellular networks. And the issue with that technology, well, up until recently, running the GPS and running the cell cards consumes quite a bit of battery.
I bet.
And so it requires it to be an external mount that has a solar panel to be able to recharge the batteries, because there's not enough battery to run that unit for any length of time. So for the Eiders, we use the Argos system. It's a big international collaboration. It was used mostly for tracking ships worldwide. So a lot of the ship tracking goes through this Argos tracking. Also, a lot of things like remote weather stations would upload their data through the Argos system. So the Argos allows data to be transmitted, from the ground up, and then it gets sent back to us or back to the Argos servers, and you can transmit some data within that. So there are Argos tags that have GPSs built on them the same way that the GSMs do, but those need to have a solar panel. Oh, okay. So we use them on geese. It work really well. But they don't work well on sea ducks and divers, because we still we don't have a really good external mount.
Okay, so you're putting them in internally.
They're all internal. Wow. So we're relying on the battery. And so that if you want it to last for any length of time, you have to be really careful about how you use that battery. And it's only been recently that they've been able to produce, the technology has got good enough that actually they're more efficient on the battery to use a GPS now than they are to use the other system for location.
Okay.
But the location from Argos, it can transmit information. So there's 3 channels that transmit data, and they'll transmit information like body temperature, battery voltage, activity. There's an activity sensor, so a little accelerometer that tells us whether the bird is alive or not. So if it was a goose and it's an external mount, we would use the accelerometer to figure out whether it's a mortality event or not, because it stops moving.
Oh, I gotcha. Yeah, that's cool.
If it's if it's an implant like we use and it's in the body cavity, then we can use it's much better. We can use temperature, so we can look to see if it's at body temperature,
right?
Or if it goes to ambient temperature, then we know it's a mortality.
It's a mortality. Okay. So what was the purpose of doing that? Just so you could track their migration?
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll step back a bit before we get into that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because
fire away.
Yeah, the other piece that I mentioned with the winter survey. So we were looking primarily. I was talking about the Maritimes and the declines, but the main purpose for that survey was to cover northern Eiders that overwinter along the lower North Shore in Quebec and around most of Newfoundland. And as part of that, we also survey the south coast of Newfoundland and the Ile de Madeleine part in the middle of the Gulf, and across to the Gaspé. There's some Eiders overwinter there as well.
Yeah, that's a nice place, that Ile de Madeleine.
Yeah. And we thought most of the birds in Ile de Madeleine were dresseri, or were the American subspecies of the common eider, as opposed to the borealis, the northern subspecies.
Okay. You called them, say that word again?
The species name for eider is Somateria melissa, and we have dresseri, which would be the subspecies that we have here, or the American subspecies, and borealis would be the northern subspecies.
Yeah, I had that word wrong. I always knew that to be dressari for some reason.
Well, it could be.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just how I say it.
So there's that and borealis, and really the only way to know is the lobes on their nose, on their beak.
That's one way. That's one way.
Yeah. One way from the eye for
yeah. We would measure them.
Right.
Yeah. There's several different measurements that you can take.
Okay.
So as part of that, we're seeing these very steep declines in birds overwintering. In Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, we're seeing steep declines in birds breeding in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick.
Right.
Well, we know in New Brunswick, we think in Nova Scotia, and we've since confirmed that through analysis of the banding data sets.
Right.
And then the abandonment of these major molt sites. But what we were seeing was an increase in the number of birds that are overwintering in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So not the major overwintering areas in the Gulf in Quebec are in Île-de-Madeleine, and to the north of that around Anacostia, and then around the Mingan Archipelago, so around Havre Saint-Pierre. And the number that are overwintering around Anacostia and around Havre Saint-Pierre have remained fairly constant. But we've seen very large increase in the number of birds that are overwintering in Île-de-Madeleine and across the south coast of Newfoundland. It's just been a tremendous increases in the number of birds that are overwintering. So, my feeling was what was happening was the birds, a large chunk of the American subspecies breed, maybe 30-40% breed in the estuary in Quebec. It's the largest concentration of breeding birds there, and historically it would have been there and in Maine where most of them are breeding.
Right.
And so we thought those birds were short stopping. So those birds from Quebec would normally migrate south to overwinter, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Maine, Massachusetts. And we thought they were just short stopping. And that's where the telemetry study started. We were wondering, how where these birds are. We knew from banding the associations between the breeding colonies and where they overwinter. But when you're unable to catch that many birds, and with the banding, we have our direct recovery rate. So if we put out 100 bands, we'll get about 1.5 back, maybe less, in a year.
Really?
So it takes a long time to build a picture using banding. So we did that. With satellite telemetry, of course, I put a radio on the bird, I can follow it for 3 years.
Yeah, you can do it right now.
Yeah.
Wonder where it is. I can tell you.
Yeah. So that's why we started the program, was to understand how the distributions of birds were changing. And we're also interested in what's driving the change in those distributions. And our feeling was that what may be driving it was ocean warming.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so ocean warming has a pretty big impacts on everything. There's lots of distributions that are changing. So we see, I'm sure you know the stories of the right whale, where we had off Grand Manan, George's Bank, off Nova Scotia, were the major summering areas, breeding areas for those whales. In 2 years, they changed from there to be up off the Gas Bay.
Right.
Big movements. And they shifted from they feed on a copepod, so a little invertebrate that's really abundant. And they shifted from feeding on the copepods in the Bay of Fundy, which would probably have disappeared because of the warming temperatures. I'm just guessing now, but they're feeding on a different species now in off the Gulf, or in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So we've seen these massive changes in distributions,
right?
And a lot of it we don't see. It's all happening under the water.
Yeah, absolutely. I bet.
Yeah. And what we think is it may be having effects on blue mussels, which is the primary food for Eiders.
Okay.
So we're seeing, maybe it's not so good for blue mussels in the Maritimes, but like I mentioned off the Île-de-Madeleine, normally, there warming waters is actually quite good because historically it's mostly covered in ice, in sea ice.
Right.
And there's very little open water. And now there's huge areas of open water, so there's a lot more habitat available for Eiders to overwinter in. So we think that the response maybe not that there's more mussels, it's just that there's a lot more habitat available for the birds to take advantage of.
Right.
And what the telemetry has told us is I wasn't right. Those birds are not birds from Quebec, from the estuary in Quebec that are short stopping, that are in the overwintering in Île-de-Madeleine and the south coast of Newfoundland. Most of the birds from Quebec are going straight down between Cape Cod and Nantucket to overwinter, and there's birds from all segments of the breeding population are now going to that primarily this one little spot. And the birds that are overwintering in Ile de Madeleine are coming off the North Shore, the lower North Shore in Quebec, off Newfoundland, and out of Labrador, where numbers have been increasing quite rapidly on the breeding colonies there.
Yeah.
Well, they have been. It's not been recent tracking, but at least in the past where we have data, it shows really strong increases.
So when I was looking at the time lapse of your GPS, or your, I'm going to call it telemetry, is what it is, right? Yeah, tracking. You could see that a lot of the ones from the Gas Bay just, instead of flying around, which I would have assumed that they did, they just said, okay, we're pointing south and we're going right over the land. I thought, holy man, that's a long trip for a bird that spends basically all its life in the water to fly over that much land.
Their spring migration brings them primarily up the coast. They come right up the coast. They come over the isthmus between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, up through the Memramcook Valley, cut across into Shediac or various places, and then they make their way up. And in the fall, it's quite surprising to see that a lot of the birds turn west and fly towards Quebec City. They hit just before the eastern end of Ile d'Orléans, and they go south down over Vermont, Maine, directly to Massachusetts.
Yeah.
There's a chunk of them that come around as well, but the majority of those birds are doing an overland flight down into the U.S.
I suppose that, even around here we have some pretty big lakes and there's lots of water there. So I guess if they get ready to stop, they just stop on any one of those lakes, I suppose.
But the migration is fast.
It is, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, would they do that in a day? Would they go
probably,
They would, eh? Yeah. Go from Quebec, clear down.
We could look.
Yeah.
But they're making big movements.
Wow.
I mean,
they catch a good tailwind and go?
Yeah.
Because, realistically, there was birds here that were here before the full moon, and then like that, they were in Newfoundland.
It's really fast.
We had a southwest wind, and I'm like, oh, full moon, southwest wind.
That's for geese.
Yep. Yeah. And then they were gone.
The migration is really fast. One of the problems with the units that we're using, unlike the GSM, that's able to sample its location frequently. The way our radios acquire location is not through a GPS.
Right.
It's calculated that the radio broadcasts on a very specific frequency, and and every radio is on a slightly different frequency, and we know what that frequency is. And there's a satellite going overhead, and it's moving. So I just lost the name of that. Is it the Coriolis effect, I think? When you listen to a siren and it's going by you, and the frequency it changes as it goes by.
Yep.
It's using that shift in the frequency to estimate the location.
Oh, okay.
For using that and a bunch of fancy math, it can estimate its location. It's not as precise as GPS.
Right.
We're probably 1.5 kilometers for most locations. Some of them are down to meters.
Right.
Yeah. But it's a different technology, and we have to broadcast. The radio has to broadcast, or it has to be a satellite up there to hear it.
Right.
And so it costs a lot of battery to transmit.
Sure.
So what we do is we put the radio on a duty cycle that only transmits infrequently. So we use a cycle normally of 2 and 72. So it's on for 2 hours, off for 72. So you get a location every 3 days.
Right. And
the migration certainly has happened within those 3 days.
Yeah.
But that's why I say it's very fast, but and some birds we can pick up because we can pick up their movements. But we just don't have the precise enough locations to actually see how fast the migration really was. We missed the two ends of it usually.
Well, yeah, and I totally get what you mean about it's hard to put a backpack on them, so to speak, with the GPS.
We don't put a backpack.
Well, no, I know, but I mean, we talked about that earlier about how, you know, if you could do that like you do with the geese, and it would be, but it doesn't last in the salt, I suppose.
No, I think it does fine.
It would. It would last.
The problem is, you know what, with the divers is that if you put something on it, it treats it like it's a breach of its insulation. And so it changes behavior. It spends a lot of time preening, trying to get rid of that thing, you know.
Oh, okay.
Like, you know, for, you know, a drop of oil the size of a dime will kill a duck.
Right.
And in the winter, because it breaches its insulation, it just loses energy through that breach. So there's behavioral impacts. Also, it's got to carry that thing around. It's affecting it. And we don't know all of it. We just know that the behavior, right now we don't have an external attachment that we feel comfortable putting on a sea duck or a diving duck.
Yeah, makes sense.
That lasts for any length of time.
Sure.
Yeah, we have some short-term attachments that work, but ones that require, you know, it to be, we can attach it to a band, no problem, but a band doesn't, we don't have access to the sun to recharge. It has to have access to the sun. Yeah. Yeah, so all ours are implanted by a veterinary team. We carry a team of vets around with us.
Yeah, that's awesome. When I was watching that video I was talking about that you were on, I said, "Wow, what a process!" And then to be able to, you know, take them and put them back out on the water, and away they go. You know, they just got a little antenna poking up through. You know, So it's a neat process. So is that something you're still working on? I mean, you have a passion for sea ducks. Like when I think about you as a sea duck biologist.
Yeah. So I mean, my part in the project is pretty much done now. We put out the last radios. We put out maybe 15, I think, in Rhode Island a year ago. Now it was a year ago, March, and then a year ago at the end of April, we put out 27 in Eiders, Pierre, on the lower North Shore in Quebec. So those are the last radios that come out. I also put out some it's under a different project with the Labrador Inuit, or the Nunavut government. We put out, I can't remember how many, 25 or 27 radios with them as well in Northern Labrador.
Oh, wow.
But it's not part of the same project.
Okay.
But those radios will potentially, you know, provide data for up to 3 years of movement. So we're still a ways away from the end of the data collection, but we're done with, you know, putting radios on birds and collecting samples. Now it's mainly data management. And we're transitioning, you know, it's going to be other people that take over now that are the quantitative people that are really good with the analysis. And we have now Lined Up Ducks Unlimited is taking on a big component of it. So we have funded a project with the EU to write up, or to analyze and write up a big part of the data. And then we're hoping to have another postdoc that's going to work on all the wintering data. And they're with the University of Rhode Island. So that's our hope. So it's transitioning from, you know, the field to, you know, the quantitative people that can analyze the data now and write it up.
It's a big process, huh?
Yeah.
So at the time in those videos, you guys were on an island and you were catching them with nets. They were chasing them around, or they were nesting in there, and you were trying to catch them on the nest, or you had fishing nets chasing them around, catching them. Is that the way you would normally do that then?
That was not the way that we planned.
That was plan B or C?
That was the second attempt at Nova Scotia.
Okay.
So, I mean, we really wanted to catch birds before they were nesting.
Right.
And so, because one of the pieces of information we're interested in is the proportion of adult females that are actually breeding.
Okay.
So with Eiders, they're what we call capital breeders. By capital breeders, they need capital, and their capital is mainly fat.
Right.
And we were talking, I think, just before the show that, you know, that in the spring, this time of year right now, the eiders go through a period of hyperphagia where they feed really, really, really hard. And they put on, they can put on, well, an eider, like its weight can vary for a female from when she finishes incubation, she may weigh just over a kilogram. She could weigh under a kilogram. When she starts breeding, when she's really fat and hasn't laid any eggs yet, she can weigh 2.5 kilograms.
Wow.
So she may lose more than half her body weight from when she starts to lay eggs till she gets off the nest with ducklings.
Wow.
And I mean, they're really designed like to breed in the Arctic, where they arrive. When they arrive, there's nothing, everything's still frozen. There might be some water to land on, but there's not access to food. So they have to bring everything with them to make the eggs and get through incubation. So if they don't have enough fat, then they can't breed. So, and with eiders, they're long-lived. They have relatively small clutches. So they have a clutch size. It's usually between 3 and 4 eggs, maybe 3.5, 3.8 is usually average clutch size. But, they might live for 12 or 15 years as an adult. So they can delay breeding because the consequences of breeding and running out of fat is that you might die on the nest.
Right.
So it's better for them to delay or postpone breeding and come back the next year if they don't have adequate nutrient reserves for breeding.
Okay.
So this is what we're interested in, is where the birds actually, were they having problems reaching body condition for breeding.
Okay.
So we really wanted to catch birds before they initiated their clutches, because as soon as they start to sit or as soon as they lay an egg, I mean, an egg is a great big package of energy. Everything that comes from what fat she carried, and protein as well. She's actually cannibalizing protein mainly from her breast and tissue. But a gizzard of an eider, you know what a gizzard looks like? It's like not quite the size of your fist, but
yeah.
It's big.
It's big, yeah.
But when she finishes breeding, it's not so big. It's tiny.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's actually using up her body.
Yeah. They use both fat and protein to get through. So we were really trying to catch birds before, so we could look at the condition before they were breeding, and then also look at the proportion of the females who were actually breeding and whether they were related to their condition. And we were unable, so we were using overwater mist nets. So we float it's a 38 meter mist net over the water. It works really well when when you're over a foraging site and the birds want to be on that spot, when
right.
you know what it's like when they're hunting. And
yeah.
We do the exact same thing, but it seemed like during breeding, they're just loafing. It's the only time you'll really see eiders pull out of the water. And well, there's 2 times when we see eiders pull out of the water, and sit on the rocks. Usually it's during breeding. They just start to pop out and they sit on the rocks, and it also happens, quite often when we get oiled birds. When they're oiled, they also pop out of the water and sit on the rocks.
What's that mean when they get oiled?
Well, they're conserving energy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's the same thing. They're getting out of the water because the water is sucking. It's a really good conductor of heat.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're getting out. Yeah.
This year, actually, in February, was the first time I ever saw an eider duck out of the water.
Yeah. I mean, they do get out, but you'll see them out in mass.
Okay.
Yeah.
To conserve energy. Huh.
And so they're just they're in breeding. They're attracted to the colony, and you can catch them because there's lots of birds around.
Right.
But and you have a very short window when you can catch them, because they'll start nesting, soon after they arrive, or it depends on where you are.
Right.
But we just didn't have enough birds to work the net.
Right.
The colonies were too small. There was not enough birds around just to pick them up. Like in Quebec and Maine, we had no problem.
Really? You just catch them in those mist nets.
But we caught them with dip nets in Nova Scotia, because the colonies were too small. There just wasn't enough birds to be able to, for the mist nets to be able to catch. And we didn't have enough sites. I mean, you have to have a very specific site protected from the wind and the tide, and on the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia, you also have a huge swell, and we need to be in that shallow water right in the swell, so we can't trap where there's swells.
Right.
And we had to catch birds by dip net in Newfoundland, mainly there because of ice. So the birds are arriving. We can't get on the water because it's still full of ice. We can't trap because we can't put the nets on the water because there's still ice around. Otherwise you're catching big icy bits of big bits of ice and not birds.
Right.
The same for Labrador. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got to be everything with Eider research would have to be tough. It's more gear, like you're talking about with the ice and tide and wind and.
That's what makes it fun.
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
Yeah, definitely. It's not for everybody, right?
No.
It's not for everybody. And you've spent how many years doing that?
I started working on Eiders in 1986.
So you know a thing or two about them.
I like to think I do.
Yeah.
But I say is the more you work on them, the less you realize you know.
Yeah. Yeah, because I suppose you start to figure things out.
Or you figure things out that you thought were
true or false. Yeah.
Yeah. I know what's going on, and I know the system now, and you can talk quite confidently about it, and then you can go play with the system and realize that's not the way it works.
Right.
Yeah.
So how long did that in the joint sea duck venture? That was that a project, or is that something that's still going on?
It's still going on.
Okay.
Yeah. So it started in COVID. So the project probably wouldn't happen without COVID.
Okay.
Because we couldn't go into the field.
Right.
So we had we had budgets. We couldn't fly surveys, couldn't do anything. So we had money in the budget and looking for what we could do with it.
Right.
And this project had been kind of on the books for a long, long time, but it could never be funded. It's an expensive project.
Right.
And that was enough money to think that we might be able to run a project. And we took that money and we went to the Sea Duck Joint Venture and to generate additional funds. And we brought a larger group together. So it's a large collaborative project.
Yeah. There's a lot of people involved.
Not just people. There's many different agencies. So a couple of the provinces, Ducks Unlimited. So the NGOs, universities. We got a Katy University of Rhode Island, UQAM, University of Quebec and Montreal, University of Montreal as well. The vets are coming from there. So we have, and I'm probably missing people. Parks Canada. We worked with Parks Canada. Nunavut, which is they're now claiming to be an Inuit land claim in southern Labrador. We worked with them, and we worked with Parks Canada as well. So there's many, many, many partners on the project.
Okay,
have come together. Yeah,
yeah. That's a lot of different organizations to get together.
Yeah,
and put into something like that. So obviously, there's it's on more people's radar than
And there was also I'm forgetting.
Yeah, no.
There's also the U.S. that was involved. I mentioned University of Rhode Island, but Maine State was involved. There's another non-for-profit, but they do consultant work, which is a little different in the U.S. than in Canada. There's the Biodiversity Research Institute. Those guys now probably have one of the best crews for catching sea ducks on the continent.
Is that right?
They're really specialized in catching sea ducks. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because like I say, when I think about it, it wouldn't be easy.
No.
You can have all the right things, but
when it comes together, when it works, it's really good.
I bet. Well, I just think about even hunting in the Bay of Fundy. Like, man, the tide there is so rugged.
The tide's a real challenge. Yeah.
Here it definitely would be.
Yeah.
So going through that project, do you think, and you're still involved?
Yep.
I guess.
Yep.
So far, do you think you've accomplished what your mission has been? And have you learned things that you didn't expect to learn about Eiders?
Well, I say the things that we hope to answer, I don't think we're going to be able to.
Okay.
Because I mentioned, in order we were really interested in trying to estimate what we call breeding propensity. So the proportion of adults that actually lay a nest.
Okay.
Or initiate a nest. And because we had to modify the capture technique, it means that we can still measure it, but we're sampling from a different segment of the population. So when we try to catch, birds around the island, everybody's there, and we don't know who's going to breed and who doesn't. But once we go on the island and catch a female, we know that bird had already reached breeding condition. So we're not measuring breeding condition in the year that we catch them. We're measuring in the following year, because we know we have impacts on the behavior of the bird from the capture, the implantation. So we don't use the data from the first year. But we know, it may be that, the, Eiders, I'm lost now. Sorry.
No, it's all good.
They gain experience with age. So your oldest birds are often your best breeders.
Sure.
And so it may be that we're biasing towards older birds, because the younger birds that are non-breeding, or maybe breeding, in good years might breed, in bad years they might not. They will still come to the colony.
Okay.
So we have a chance to catch them before nesting with the mist net.
Right.
But we don't have a chance to catch them if we pull them off the colony. So we may have biased our sample to birds that are more likely to breed.
Right.
It's not that we can't measure it. We'll get a measure of it, but we have to recognize that there might be a bias, that it may be measured. We may be overestimating it, because we didn't sample from the birds that we already knew had successfully initiated a nest in that year.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, I totally get what you mean there.
So we can still do it, but it's not as clean as we had hoped.
Yeah. Which, I mean,
that's the way of all field studies.
Yeah, it's the nature of the beast, right? Yeah. There's a lot of factors there. It's controlled chaos, I guess, in a way, because you're dealing with Mother Nature.
Yeah.
When do you know when to show up? You show up there, and then
the really thing that sunk us is, so, I mean, we spread our sample around so we had areas where we knew the colonies were growing in size. We had areas where we knew they're stable in size, and areas where they're declining. So the sample was spread around so that we're sampling from those three groups: declining, stable, and increasing. And the hope was to look to see if there's differences in breeding propensity between depending on what the population was doing, or what that segment was doing at the time. So Quebec, the estuary birds, was our stable population.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, they were stable in numbers. But what's happened, we put radios out there in 2021. In 2022, we had avian influenza with mass mortality events on Eiders, mainly on the colonies that we put radios on. And we can see very high mortality rates of our tag birds. We're not sure if it's avian influenza, but it happened at just before breeding in the year following the deployment of radios. Was this is something that we want to look at to see if avian influenza has influenced the survival of those birds. And then on top of that, we had a fox on the colonies. They've been, and for the last 2 years, we've had foxes on the colonies. So there's very few. We're a colony that there should be 2,000, maybe 6,000 pairs nesting. There's been hundreds of birds nesting, and the nesting has all been it gets disrupted, so it's not highly synchronous. They're nesting at different times of the year. So and very few of those birds bred. We were one to measure breeding propensity, but obviously there's other things that affect breeding propensity.
Right.
So avian influenza and the foxes have played a big role. So we were not able to use that part of the data
So
for that purpose.
when I think about it, and I think about just a regular mallard duck, I mean, their chicks, sure, they have predators that they have to worry about, but I don't feel like it's anything like a sea duck. So when
Probably more.
You think?
Yeah. Well, it's probably the same. If we look at an eider, I mentioned, if it has a survival rate of, it's just over 90%. So over 90% of adults that are 1 year will survive to the next.
Okay.
With mallards, I think it's like 70%.
Because I just think about the chicks being out there in the ocean.
Yeah. But just a sec. So you think about it, and eiders say, so at 90, at a survival rate about 0.91, adult life expectancy is around 10 years. Let's say they lay 4 eggs a year. That's about 40 eggs they lay in their lifetime.
Right.
And a mallard at adult survival of 0.7, I have to do the math, but I think their average lifespan is just over 3 years.
Right.
They lay maybe 12 or 15 eggs a year, and they get 3 years, maybe.
Right.
2 or 3 years. So they have less, less eggs.
Sure.
So it's, and it's all about the balance of, of how many of the births and the mortalities. So when they're equal, the population's stable. When you have more births and mortalities, it increases, and when you have less, it declines.
Right.
Yeah, and it's not in a year. It's what happens usually, like in a lifetime.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you feel like we've always talked about blackback seagulls, things like that, eating the chicks? You were mentioning foxes, and that brought it back to my mind about those. Like, has there ever been, as far as predator management, any thoughts for going after them?
My graduate work was done. I mean, what I worked on for my graduate work was here in New Brunswick on the wolves, was looking at predation of blackback gulls and eider ducklings.
Okay.
And, we'd worked on that colony from, not me personally. I started in 86, but the work started in the colony in 1984. And up until the point where I started working on it was in my master's, 1987, almost every duckling that we saw was eaten by a gull. And then in the 2 years when I worked there, the ducklings were swimming around and not being eaten by gulls. It was just a funny, it was just maybe an anomaly. But it kind of, if you're going to learn, that's when you really learn. When you already know the answer and you go in to answer the question, and then something completely different happens.
Right.
And that's how I started, and it wasn't as clear as. And then there was another study that came afterwards that showed very high predation rates on ducklings, but those ducklings were marked with radios, so they're carrying a little day-old duckling. You put a radio in it, it kind of makes it maybe a bit vulnerable to be taken by a gull. But Maine is very interested still in this, Maine State, and they've invested quite a bit of work, and I think maybe they've started a culling program.
Yeah, because I know even hunting in February this year, we had blackback gulls coming down and hovering over our decoys, and then coming down and trying to clip the backs of them. Grab a hold of them.
Yeah, but they may also be trying to steal mussels.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah, they will. They'll come in, and even the eiders will do it. That sometimes they'll come up with a clump of mussels, and they'll all try to steal the mussels.
Really?
And the gulls will too. That's why the gulls are often, I don't know do you use gull decoys?
No.
When we hunted eiders, we used gull decoys. They're confidence decoys, because there's often gulls sitting on the tail end of the flock, and they're there to pick up stuff.
Right, yeah.
The eiders are bringing to the surface.
Right, to scavenge and steal.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's something we've kind of thought of too, because I know that, I've seen them do it. Eat chicks. It's quite it's just an easy meal for them, right?
Yeah.
And when they're out there bobbing around in the big wide open water, they're definitely the right size for a lot of things.
Yeah, and there's a right time too, So they're really, there's a period when they can't really feed the ducklings to their chicks because most of that food is not for the adult. They're taking it to feed their chicks.
Right.
So the chick has to be old enough to handle something the size of a duckling. And then the duckling can't be too big. It can't grow too big because then it's also not, it gets too big of a prey for the gull chick.
Right.
There is a window of time that, where the breeding is synchronized, and you've got this window when the ducklings are the right size and the chicks are the right size and everything comes together, and yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
But I'd say that what's interesting about eiders and gulls, it doesn't matter where you study eiders, anywhere's in Europe, anywhere's in North America, everyone thinks that the initial work always turns to gulls as being a problem. But there's eiders everywhere, and there's gulls everywhere. To me, that also says something. They're always together.
Right.
They nest together.
Yeah.
Yeah. And historically, they've always been together. Now, there may be more gulls now because, we provide them with a lot of food. So when we elevate gull populations, maybe we're having impacts on that balance between, how many gulls are there and how many eiders are there. But I think it's not clear.
Right.
That the gulls are really an issue. And when I was a friend of mine from Finland, he's retired now too, but he's studied eiders longer than me. And he had thought one year, he said, wow, it's the boom here. They had so many ducklings that had survived. They're big enough, and he thought and typically what happens with eiders, we have no production, and then a good year.
Right.
Yeah, there's these boom years of production. And he thought he was in a boom year, and then they lost almost all those ducklings to a disease. And so it's not always clear what the issue is, and so that took them on a different track, looking at the impacts of different diseases.
Yeah, I suppose there could be several different factors, like when we think about what's going to eat an eider, or why a chick would die. Like there's.
But the other thing is, when you look at the value of whatever stage you're looking at, so you got an egg, you got a just hatched duckling, you got a duckling that survived to fledge so it can fly, you got a first-year-old, second-year-old, and then you have an adult. Well, the effects of a mortality on an egg and an adult on the population dynamics is very different, because that egg has to get to be an adult, so it needs, and not all those eggs get to be adults.
Sure.
And so that most of the ducklings that are taken by gulls are taken when the ducklings are less than a week old.
Right.
So there's still a huge amount of mortality that's going to happen between that duckling, is a week till it gets to be, 2 or 3 years old. And the one thing that, that when I did my work, we set our expectations on how many ducklings there were based on the size of the colony. So say there's, we had 1,100 nests, and say, an average of 3 eggs per nest, and maybe 3 out of those eggs hatch successfully a duckling. So, you're expecting to see 3,300 ducklings.
Right.
And you see lots of mortality. There should be, a few thousand ducklings around, and all the ducklings you see are dying because gulls are eating them. But if you turn around and say, okay, now how many ducklings do we need to sustain a stable population? And the answer is, I think it's around 300 need to survive from it. Maybe it's not 300, but it's in that order. So what you should see when you're in a colony is almost all those ducklings are going to die. Almost everyone you put your eyes on are going to die.
Wow.
Because if they don't, then in a few years you'll be able to walk across the ocean on the backs of the Eiders, because that's the way populations grow.
Okay.
So they're growing exponentially. So yeah, it really needs to, you really need to set your expectation based on, not what you think there should be. It's what there needs to be to sustain the population, and if you're going to grow it, there needs to be more than, 300 may not be the right number, but if you have more than that, it's going to increase. If you have less than that, then it could decline.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No.
But the thing is that most of them are going to die.
Which is crazy.
Probably like 80% of them, maybe 90% of them are going to die.
Yeah. Well, when you think about a duck that makes it to the adult stage of its life and then lives to be old, you were saying what, 10 years?
10 years should be if the average lifespan, yeah, for an adult, an adult, and it'll make that bird 12 years old because it took 2 years to get to be an adult.
Right.
Yeah.
Got you. Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of things that they have to go through.
Yep.
To make it that far, And I mean, there's not as many hunters around now, but there's a lot of factors there, things that are trying to kill them and eat them. And I know that you've had a major passion for not only Eiders, but sea ducks.
Eiders, yeah. I've gained some interest in scoters now over the years, but Eiders were it. Yeah. I've probably done more work on scoters now than Eiders, but
yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I don't see a lot of is white-winged scoters around.
Yeah. There's not that many.
No, huh?
No.
Huh.
No, and it's, of the three scoters, there's the white wings are the least abundant, but I would say we have no really good monitoring program for scoters. They get picked up in a few of the surveys, and we're actively working on, developing a monitoring program for scoters. So I've spent, well, not just me, it's been just like with the Eiders, so it's a big group. There's another big group of us working on scoters.
Sure.
And we're working on developing a monitoring program.
Awesome.
But it's the timing sucks.
Right.
With the way everything's unfolding. I mean, with what's going on in the U.S. right now, we don't know if they're going to be able to even run full capacity in their traditional surveys, let alone expansion, to include other areas and other species.
Yeah.
And the Wildlife Service is also challenged as well, financially, and are having really difficult time maintaining funding into the monitoring programs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. It's and we're in an election year here too, so.
Yeah, but I think it's not really related to the election. The election will make it fairly difficult for people to do things. That for us, the timing of the election is bad because during an election year during an election, there's some things we can't do.
Right.
Like maybe initiate a contract.
Right.
And right now, that's when if we miss the spring and we miss a survey, you can't do the survey. You got to wait till next year.
Right.
And so there's problems right now in initiating programs. That's when normally it's all done. Right now, April, and maybe some work's not going to be done because of the election, but it's because of the restrictions that are put on government and what they can do during an election period.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I can see that. And then, I mean, again, it's all based off of, wait 2 weeks. Well, 2 weeks from now, it's too late.
Yeah. If it's a contract and it wasn't processed before the election, then it probably won't go through. And it takes sometimes weeks or months to push a contract through now. Yeah.
Yeah, I have no doubt.
Yeah.
Well, good, man. I really appreciate you coming and sitting down and talking with me. I know that there's lots more that we could dive into. There was lots of rabbit trails we could have went down there, but we stayed on topic pretty good, I think.
I think so.
Yeah. If you're willing again, love to have you on and we can look over some of that data that you brought next time?
I was just going to show you some pictures.
Oh, okay.
And maybe a video or something if I can find one.
Okay.
Yeah, it might take me a while, but I could just show you a few things.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sounds good, man. Well, I appreciate you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot.
Yeah.